And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather is showing this slow-moving, still pretty deep low-pressure area, continuing to bring windy conditions with lots of shower activity to the Aleutians, into the Alaska Peninsula, and also to a lesser extent here along the southwest coast. And this front kind of elongated now along the North Gulf Coast, bringing a chance of snow across much of south central Alaska. I must say that would be light snow, heaviest over the mountainous terrain, with rain and snow for the North Gulf Coast. Snow from Juneau up to the Haynesboro area, looking for several inches tonight. Mostly rain to the south. And gusty winds continue. Blizzard warning continues for the Arctic coast. High wind warning for eastern Norton Sound there, Unalakleet area. And very windy conditions here over the eastern interior as well. And for tomorrow, Thursday, clouds and moisture spread up toward the Yukon Flats there, with a chance of snow all across the eastern and southeast interior. Better chance, of course, down along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island with the south-southwest flow. Periods of precipitation there, and still periods of light rain or snow over the southeast coast. And wind slowly diminishing out over the Bering Sea as this low begins to track eastward. And for Friday, it really weakens and pulls off to the east here. You can see moving into the Aleutian Range there over the Alaska Peninsula. So much lighter winds, but still snow shower chances along the west coast here, all the way up into the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island. New system here brings increasing wind and rain into the central Aleutians in the afternoon. And this system tracks mostly in toward the northern Queen Charlotte Islands, but that'll nudge some rainfall up into the southern southeast coast with drier conditions to the north. Coastal water forecast, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots with higher gusts tomorrow on the south coast of the Panhandle. Central coast, lighter winds out of the south at 15 knots. Then southwest 20 to 25 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, kind of a windy day tomorrow. Southerly winds 25, gusts 40 knots. And about the same for Stevens Passage, with south winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. For Friday, southeast winds 25 knots, Clarence Strait. Northeast winds 20 to 25 knots for the south coast, or seas as high as 20 feet. Central coast, east-northeast 20 knots, and 15 to 20 knot easterly winds for the north coast. Lynn Canal, winds swinging around to the south at 15 knots, and southeast 15 knots for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, small craft advisory, southeast winds 25 knots and seas up to 11 feet. Prince William Sound, southeast winds 20 knots for Thursday with 4-foot seas. South to southwest winds 20 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Southeast at 20. For the western North Gulf Coast, seas at 12 feet. Southeast winds 25 knots for the Barren Islands. East winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. Prince William Sound, Cook Inlet, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots with 5 to 7 foot seas. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, northeasterlies 15 to 20 knots. East to 20 for Kamishak Bay, southeast 20 for the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, east to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, and Prince William Sound, east winds 20 knots with seas at 4 feet. Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 25 knots, seas 5 to 15 feet. And for the Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisory, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots, with Bristol Bay looking at a southeast wind at 25 knots. And for Friday, Bristol Bay, south winds 25 knots. The Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories for west-southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, gale warnings. West-southwest winds 35 knots. And the central Aleutians, westerlies 30 to 35 knots, and gale warnings for the western Aleutians for west-northwesterlies 35 to 40 knots. Those drop off considerably on Friday for the western Aleutians there. North winds 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka, south winds at 20 to 25 knots. And west-southwest winds 20 to 30 knots for the eastern Aleutians. Southwest coast tomorrow, as well as St. Lawrence Island, all northeast at 25 knots. Brisk wind advisories there. Brisk wind advisories also for Norton Sound, northeast winds at 30 knots. Gale warning, St. Matthew Island, northeast at 35, and the Pribilofs looking at north winds at 30 knots. For Friday, Pribilof Islands, northwest winds 20 knots, north at 20 for St. Matthew Island. East 25 knots for Norton Sound, otherwise St. Lawrence Island, east at 20 knots. Northeast 20 for the Yukon Delta coast, and northeast at 15 there south of Nunivak Island. Gale warnings continue for the central and eastern Arctic coast tomorrow for east winds at 40 knots. Brisk wind advisories western Arctic coast, east winds 30 knots. Brisk wind advisories also for the Chukchi Sea for east-northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. And for Friday, not much change up here. Gale warnings continue for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Out of the east, 35 to 40 knots. East at 30 knots there for the western Arctic coast. And east-northeast, 25 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea.